Jeff Gerth and Peter Dale Scott lead a workshop on organized crime and the economics of conspiracy at a 3-day conference held in Boston the first weekend in February 1975. The conference was sponsored by the Cambridge-based Assassination Information Bureau. The title of the conference, The Politics of Conspiracy and Assassination. Peter Dale Scott is author of The War Conspiracy and has been researching links between the assassination of John Kennedy and figures involved in the Watergate break-in. Jeff Gerth is a journalist and investigator of corruption and corporate and organized crime. His works have appeared in The Village Voice, Penthouse, and other publications. He has done extensive research into Watergate, particularly in the area of Nixon-Rebozo finances. Here is the workshop on organized crime and conspiracy, recorded in Boston on February 1st, 1975.
Jeff, I think, will give the sort of broader analysis, and I wanted to talk today more concretely, because I believe that if we look more at the background of Jack Ruby, we learn something about the relationship between politics and organized crime in this country, which is helpful both to understanding the assassination and more particularly the role of the Warren Commission in covering up in the wake of the assassination, but also is helpful by studying Jack Ruby. You really learn more about the workings of American politics in general, so I think it's worth doing. And I hope that it'll cast some light on what I call the gray alliance in this country between politics, business, and organized crime, which can establish a power system in, say, a city like Chicago, where Ruby came from, and also, as I've tried to show in other writings, in colonies of the United States overseas, in the Caribbean, for example. You see the same kind of gray alliance. And not only that, but you find that people who are prominent in that kind of connection in Chicago, for example, actually become interested in casino investments in Havana or somewhere else. Ruby would have been in some ways, I think, important in history even without the events in Dallas, because of his relation to the history of organized crime in Chicago, which is, however, a slightly complex one. And I don't pretend wholly to understand it. I see him related to two very important events in the post-war history of organized crime, both of which had important political and economic consequences. First of these was the takeover of a little local of a junk dealers union, the Waste Handlers Union, Local 10467 in Chicago, by a man called Paul Dorfman. By coincidence, it happened to be Ruby's local, and in fact, Ruby was the secretary-treasurer of the local, who was succeeded after a murder in the local by Paul Dorfman. And from that germ spread outwards the pension fund scheme, whereby the pension fund of a union is used for investment purposes, and the man who became so very prominent in the whole manipulation of the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, CSPF, I'll call that from now on, was Paul Dorfman's son, Alan Dorfman. And it's ironic that the capsule description of the takeover of this local, 10467, the murder of the head of it, Cook, and the takeover by Dorfman, was written up by Bobby Kennedy in The Enemy Within as the beginning of the Teamster pension fund gimmick, and it just happened that Ruby was there and was the chief witness to the murder. And if you read about that murder in the Chicago Tribune way back in 1939, what they know about it is what they learned from somebody called Jack Rubenstein, who is our man Jack Ruby. That was an important event. And the other event, which was perhaps even more important, was the takeover, or the struggle over the racing wire service, which had been put together. Yes?
Does any of this appear in the hearings?
Well, I could, if you like, show you how the report deals with it and show you what a really...
No, in the hearings. Is there anything about Jack Ruby's background in Chicago? the Union?
Well, I wish I had volume 15. We could look up Dorfman in the index. My memory is that it's not in the 15 volumes of the hearings. It is in the 11 volumes of the appendix, which are not indexed.
The exhibits?
Yes, right. There is actually among the exhibits, and it's all in volume 22, there is an FBI interview of Paul Dorfman, and it's a very misleading one, and an even more misleading summary of it in the report, which I can give you if you're interested. The significant thing is that the Warren Report could not deal candidly and honestly with this relationship of Ruby to an important event in the history of organized crime because I believe the kind of lawyers who had been put together to staff the Warren Commission and many of the members of the Commission themselves were themselves too intimately related to this same kind of gray alliance system in this country to be able to stand outside of it and look at it disinterestedly and call a spade a spade. They certainly could. One of the worst chapters in the Warren Report is the appendix, which deals with the life history of Jack Ruby. It's just funny when you read it, knowing the real facts, to see how paper thin it is. Let me give the other event where Ruby again may have been rather intimately connected. There is also in volume 22, there's an FBI interview of a man called Dave Yaris, whom they don't identify. They just say where they interviewed him. And all it says is that Yaris, and now I quote from the report, claims that Sparky, now that's Jack Ruby, knew Lenny Patrick like he, that is to say Yaris, knows Lenny Patrick, but Sparky was positively on his own and not outfit connected, not connected to the mob. And then it goes on to say Sparky was a Romeo who was most successful in picking up girls. Well, the report used a bit of that FBI interview. It used the part that Ruby was a Romeo. That's the only part they used. They didn't tell you who Yaris was. They didn't tell you who Patrick was. Ruby knew both of them as well as they knew each other. Well, Yaris and Patrick were two members of the mob in Chicago who were arrested for the murder of James Reagan and in the fight for the control of the wire service in 1946 after World War II. And these were two men who were indicted, but the case against them was dropped. Why was it dropped? Because one or maybe even two witnesses were killed in very short order. The policeman who tried to prosecute them was fired from the police force, and when the Kefauver Committee came to Chicago, the policeman came around to a lawyer called Louis Kuttner, who I'll say a bit more about in a second, said he had some new information about the Reagan killing. He drove home from the lawyer's office to his own house and was struck down and shot dead in his own garage, and so the whole case has still never been solved. But something is very clear, and that is that Yaris and Patrick at least knew each other very well. Ruby was part of that background, and the whole matter was never pursued. Well, most of us have forgotten that right after the Kennedy assassination, Louis Kuttner came forward and said that he had known Ruby, and that in fact he had been the go-between between Jack Ruby and the Kefauver Committee. And that is something which definitely ought to have been pursued and wasn't. In fact, I went to the archives myself. The first thing I did was to get the archives name file on Louis Kuttner, and there is one and only one FBI interview of Kuttner in there. It's about 4 lines long. It's a week after the assassination, and it says that Louis Kuttner advised telephonically that he had nothing to add to what he had already told the FBI in his first interview, and that there was no point in pursuing the matter further. That's the only FBI interview in the archives for Louis Kuttner. We tried to find out where the first FBI interview was and if it ever even reached the Warren Commission. As far as we can make out, it never reached the Warren Commission, if indeed the FBI made a written note of it at all. This could be terribly important because of the importance of the struggle over the wire service for organized crime. And I'm just going to read something on this respect. Do you all know roughly what a racing wire service is? We have little bookie shops all over the country, and they have to know the latest information about the races, and they have to know what the odds are, and all of this information comes in by the wire service. And it's become a monopoly. And really, so if you don't buy the wire service from these people, you don't know what's going on. So you have to buy it, and it's become a kind of private tax on the bookie industry in this country. And in fact, the latest government study of organized crime, one of the recent commissions, really calls it a kind of extortion racket, because these people have to pay exorbitant rates for the wire service, whether they really want it or not. And a man called Rufus King, who knows quite a lot about these things, says that the struggle over the control for the wire service in 1946, when Reagan was killed by the Chicago mob, was a struggle for really the control of what I would call the Gray Alliance. Let me show you how he spells that out. And all of this is Rufus King, who is frequently a government expert at organized crime hearings. Following the murder of James E. Reagan of Continental Press in 1946, into the center of the spider's web moved Tony Accardo and Greasy Thumb Guzik, the heirs of Al Capone from Chicago, with satellite gang overlords joining them from every crime center in the country. To attribute half the gang killings and mob violence of the 40s and 50s to battles over control of this gambling empire would be a very conservative speculation. Whoever controlled the wire service drops in a town became master of gambling activities there. And more often than not, he also responsibly controlled, and the word is responsibly chosen. He also controlled, not responsibly controlled, he also controlled. The word is responsibly chosen, controlled the community's local law enforcement agencies. You controlled the police. And then he explains why in the next sentence. No one could run a substantial book without the wire service. And once you've got the patrolman and his lieutenant and his captain and the chief taking bribes from your organization for protection of a harmless little gambling enterprise, you have got them for all purposes. I hope you understand how that works. You see, you've got these little local bookies, and they've got a friendly relationship with the cop, and it all looks very innocent. The cop takes a bribe, but also the precinct captain has to take a bribe, and in the end, the chief or somebody up near the end of it is on the take as well. And once you've got them on the take, you have got them. They cannot turn around and expose you because you can expose them. And there are many kinds of testimony that at least in the late 40s, when Ruby moved down to Dallas, that was the situation in Dallas. The later McClellan hearings talk about local judges on the take. A witness in the assassination, a man called Paul Roland Jones, who had come down. The Chicago mob moved into Dallas at just the time that Ruby himself moved down into Dallas, and he talked about how there were payoffs to the county authorities through a law firm called Irwin and Irwin. He didn't name the law firm. He said T.K. Irwin, who was the senior partner of the law firm. It's very interesting to find that in 1962, one of the members of this family law firm, Ivan Irwin, was a lawyer for a man called Pete White, who ought to have been a prime suspect or at least witness in the investigation and never was. Pete White was a lawyer who had fixed things up for Ruby. In 1954, had got Ruby out of a liquor violation in his nightclub, admitted this frankly, that he had been Ruby's lawyer. And Pete White had also admitted that he had run into Ruby a couple of days before the assassination, although nothing was said about this. But for some reason, in 1964, Pete White has a new law partner, or at least a new man sharing his law office and sharing his telephone, a man called William A. McKenzie. Who is William A. McKenzie? Marina Oswald's lawyer and a friend of Robert Oswald's. And here was this commission looking all over the place for a connection between Ruby and Oswald, and they looked and they looked and they looked. And they never saw that Ruby's old lawyer, still in contact with him, was sharing an office with the man who became Marina Oswald's lawyer. So for this reason, the telephone number of Marina's lawyer, RI1-1295, was in one of the Ruby notebooks that they were going through so closely. I think they knew what was going on because they had one witness up there. They went through the whole notebook and they asked him about 50 names and telephone numbers. And when they came to the name and telephone number of Pete White, RI1-1295, they skipped. They went right over it and went straight to the next number. Most of the other names were junk names. But this really interesting name was never asked. What I suspect from all this is that there was a kind of fix on in Dallas, and that Ruby was at least, that Pete White and the Irwins were connected to it, and that Ruby in his own way was connected to it. I have been focusing on the fact that Ruby is around the scene for important events in the history of organized crime, but I'm not saying that he was simply a member of organized crime. I suspect that it's quite possible, in a way, his position was not as easily definable as that he may have been a kind of go-between between organized crime on the one side and the Dallas police, law enforcement authorities on the other. In fact, it's one of the things that's so funny about the report's treatment of Ruby is that they talk about him as somebody who showed an extreme interest in police activities, and they let it go as that. We have it we have sworn testimony in volume 13 that one of the policemen regarded, I'll quote it to you, that he regarded Jack Ruby as a source of information in connection with his investigatory activities. That is a Detective Eberhardt speaking. It's very interesting. He comes from the Special Services Bureau and the police force, which I think was the key element to look at, because they're the vice squad and the narcotics squad. They are the subversive activities people. They would watch for what Cubans were doing and friends of Castro, all of that in one area, and protection of very important personages like presidents when they come to Dallas. You do all the protective intelligence for that. So I think the SSB were prime suspects. And this man, Eberhardt, who regarded Ruby as a source of information, was in the narcotics field. And I do believe, I don't have time to tell you now, maybe in questions later, that I think that Ruby may have been an informant in the narcotics area for the Dallas police and also possibly for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in those days, and that then we would really begin to see some of the really interesting overlaps between what happened in Dallas, what happened in Watergate. I'll take one question, but Jeff should really speak. Can you wait till Jeff has spoken? I don't think I have anything more to say, but you see, my point was to suggest to you that there is a kind of connection there, that Ruby was not an insignificant personage in this kind of connection, that events in Chicago years ago were important to Dallas because the Chicago mob had moved down there just when Ruby moved down in the post-war years. And now finally, I didn't have time to lay it all out to you, but a man who is very important in the Chicago connection is an industrialist called Henry Crown. In fact, Drew Pearson's memoirs says that he had heard that the people who really profited from the murder of James E. Reagan, he names them. I'll just quote what he says so that you can sue his estate for libel and not me. I learned that the whole the killing of Reagan pointed to the Hilton hotel chain Henry Crown, who was a shareholder and director in the Hilton Empire, or was then, Henry Crown, the big Jewish financier in Chicago, and Walter Annenberg, the man who originally the son of the man who originally put the wire service together. Okay, we could say an awful lot about Henry Crown, about the fact that in '63 he was the largest shareholder in General Dynamics at the time of that controversial TFX contract that tied in with the Bobby Baker scandals, which would bring us back to Bedford Wynne, who I was talking about last night. But let's just say one thing about Henry Crown. He had a lawsuit on in '63, '64 over control of his own corporation. Who was his lawyer at that time? Am I going to get a block here? Who was his lawyer? Albert Jenner. Who was Albert Jenner? Warren Commission staff who was specifically in the charge of seeing if there was any conspiracy. So that's why I suggest to you that the Gray Alliance was at work not only in the politics of Chicago and Dallas, but was also at work on the national level, and that if you were to go to lawyers like Albert Jenner, and I could go through the whole staff if you like. There was a former Murchison lawyer there. It's incredible how they staffed that thing. These were not the people to come forward and say, look, there's a gray alliance at work in this country. There is an unhealthy alliance between politics, economics, and organized crime. We had to go somewhere else to hear that kind of information. And luckily, one of the people who knows most about it in the country is sitting right beside me here, Jeff Gerth. So let's let him say a bit more about this sort of thing.
I think the best way to begin is maybe to talk about that there definitely was a motive for there being organized crime involvement. There definitely was a motive for there being organized crime involvement in the assassination, and in more than one assassination. And I think, to put it succinctly, the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, was undertaking the most exhaustive investigation and prosecution of organized crime that was ever done in this country, arising in part out of his work as counsel for the McClellan Committee, where he came into firsthand contact with. Bobby Kennedy was out after organized crime, which he defined as the enemy within in his book, and there's very clear evidence that the Kennedy Justice Department was making serious inroads. They had targeted a number of major leading figures and were in the process of sending them out of the country, sending them to jail, and breaking up the criminal organization. And it's more than interesting to note that within a week after the assassination, and I remember Bobby Kennedy was still Attorney General, although of course his brother was no longer president, a special unit within the Justice Department began to investigate the assassination. And the first place they went was to organized crime. And I've seen the memos and I've talked to the person who headed the investigation. And it was clear in the minds of many Kennedy people that there was significant organized crime, both motive and involvement, in the assassination. And of course later, a number of years later, there surfaced the report of a Teamster official in Puerto Rico who was sent to assassinate Bobby Kennedy, and only through the intervention of Jimmy Hoffa did that attempt get called off. And that's in a book, The Fall and Rise of Jimmy Hoffa by Walter Sheridan. I guess the best way to start is there's a lot of talk right now about the notion of petrodollars, and that there's all of a sudden there's surplus money in the international money markets because of surplus revenues to the oil-producing countries. And I think that's a good analogy to organized crime, because if we go back 20, 30, maybe 40 years, we'll be able to discern that organized crime, starting in Prohibition and going up through black markets of World War II and all kind of other operations which they engage in, were generating incredible sums of revenue. The government estimates, which are basically conservative and based on incomplete data, put the figures at 20 to 30 billion dollars a year, all of which, of course, is invisible, untaxed, some of which, of course, goes to payoffs and protection and to people, but most of which goes out of the country and is washed and laundered and recycled back into the economic money markets of the world. Now, if you take those figures and start to add them up and compound them, because the money doesn't sit still, it gets reinvested. And the return is, 10, 15, 20%. Within 10, 15, 20 years, you come up with figures that I estimated this once, and I don't have the article I did in front of me, but you come up with a sum of money that's that's greater than the 10 largest corporations in the United States put together. So we're talking about a lot of money, hundreds of billions of dollars that is continually being reinvested and washed and put into investments, and so we're talking about a large economic empire. And you can't talk about organized crime without talking about it as a financial empire, because that's what it is. Now, I think the best way to go on from there is to demonstrate where this money has gone and what parts of the economy have come under organized crime influence and control. And of course, originally, the markets, so to speak, that organized crime was involved in were the so-called markets of vice: prostitution, bootlegging, gambling, narcotics, etc. And out of that, this, of course, all started back as early as the 1920s, and labor racketeering also, extortion. And as the mores and morals of the country changed, of course, a lot of vices became legalized, so to speak, such as the liquor industry. And in turn, organized crime became legitimized and began to move. If you take the word vice and kind of turn it on its head, you come up with the word leisure. And in a way, the two are synonymous. And what has happened is that organized crime has become the dominant economic force in the leisure industry in the United States. And to give you some examples, all of which can be backed up by documents, and later on I can go into specifics if people are interested. If you look at hotels, resorts, real estate developments, entertainment, sports, the distribution and servicing, for example, trucking and selling of supplies to hotels and restaurants, and the unions which do this kind of work, especially the Teamsters Union, but also the Culinary Workers Union, the Hotel and Service Bartenders Union, Motion Picture Projectors Unions. There's just a whole history of mob infiltration and penetration of these industries. So what we have is the evolvement of organized crime into a legitimate economic and business entity in the United States over a period of 20, 25 years. Now, concomitantly, if we take a look at the economy of the United States over the last 25 years, we discover that we have what's known as the age of affluence or the age of leisure or whatever you want to call it. But when you look at the figures, you discover that productivity, industrial productivity in this country, the growth of industrial productivity has declined significantly, especially in the last 15 years. And the output of goods has declined. And what has increased, of course, is services. And there are innumerable statistics, government statistics, to back that up. So what we have is our economy is increasingly characterized by leisure, affluence, surplus, and of course, I'm not trying to draw a causal relationship. I'm just trying to demonstrate that organized crime has significant control over certain sectors of the economy, and that these sectors, in turn, are increasingly important in the structure and makeup of the American economy over the last 25 years. Now, I'll do a little diversion on what this means for the economy and inflation and a few other things which are kind of relevant today. Because our economy has declined in its ability to make productive goods, and I'll cite one statistic here. In 1960, the United States ranked first in manufacturing output among all the Western nations and Canada. And by 1972, the United States ranked last in those very same statistics. And there are many books which document the decline of American technology and ability to produce, basic industrial goods. And the corollary to this, of course, is that we've produced a lot of paper. Paper meaning securities, money, non-productive goods. It's not coincidental, therefore, that the largest industry in the United States is banking, which is nothing more than the facilitation and maneuvering and manipulation of paper. And if you want a good background on this, you might start with the Business Week issue of about 2 months ago, where they did a whole issue on credit and demonstrated that the economy is basically a paper economy, and that there's $1 trillion in credit in the United States, and that the rise in credit is incredibly alarming and has parallels to the 1920s, etc. Now, if you know anything at all about economics, you realize that that's nothing but a classical inflationary situation, because you have tons and tons more money and very few goods. And anytime you have more money chasing fewer goods, you're going to have inflation. And so you have this structural situation built into the economy over the last 15, 20 years. Now, what I'd like to do in terms of organized crime and trying to get down to a little more basics is to talk about conglomerates as a case study in this convergence we're talking about. Again, we're talking about the rise of leisure and affluence and surplus and paper as a dominant American characteristic, and we're also talking about the rise and penetration of organized crime within this sector of the economy. And I think conglomerates really are a perfect case study and crucible to talk about. Starting around the middle 60s, conglomerates became one of the dominant economic forces in the United States. And in fact, it can be shown that conglomerates took away from basic industry most of the equity financing in this country, which means that there was no money available for basic industry to expand and to keep up with other economies that were, for example, West Germany and Japan, which made tremendous capital investments into things like steel and basic industry. So today you're in a point where the United States is so backward in steel and the technology of producing steel that it can't compete in the international market. And again, the conglomerates were taking away all the financing because banks and other sources of credit were putting all kind of money into conglomerates because they were, hot stocks and through all kind of phony accounting techniques, creating what looked to be great glamour, great growth, etc. But again, if you look at conglomerates, what they were creating was a lot of paper. And rather than bore you with how it happens, I'll refer you to a book called Unaccountable Accounting by Abraham Brilloff, which shows how through the use of various accounting techniques, conglomerates did nothing but produce paper. Unaccountable Accounting by Abraham Brilloff.
You spell Brilloff?
Brilloff. And also there's a book called The Go-Go Years by John Brooks, which is out in paperback. And there's a quote in there where he's talking about one of the conglomerates. And what they were trying to show for Wall Street was that they could produce a lot of profits. They didn't care about goods. He was talking about a thing called National Student Marketing, which was a high-flying conglomerate which eventually went bankrupt. But its stock went from 0 to 160 back down to 0. And it didn't do anything but create a lot of paper profits. Now, the important thing is that organized crime has made significant inroads into American conglomerates, and I'll name about half a dozen. Rapid American Corporation, which major component of which is Schenley Industries, which is in the liquor business and which got started by a guy who was involved in bootlegging with Meyer Lansky, one of the leading organized crime figures. And if you want documentation on this, you can go to the New York State Legislative Investigative Commission and a number of other references. Gulf and Western, which is, of course, one of the major conglomerates in the United States, I don't know, $2, $3, $4 billion in assets. I can't keep track of it. It buys up so many companies that it's hard to keep track. Organized crime began to make inroads into Gulf and Western around 1966 and 67 with the acquisition of New Jersey Zinc and Paramount Pictures. The movie industry since the 1930s has been controlled by organized crime. The genesis was the movie extortion shakedown, which took place in the late 1930s and for which a number of Capone mobsters were convicted in 1943 in federal court in New York. And the mob's influence over Paramount and other movie picture companies has not ceased. Now, to give you a little example of what Gulf and Western got into through the organized crime element in it, around 1967-68, Gulf and Western created a real estate leisure division, which was headed by a guy named Phil Levin. And again, there's evidence of his involvement with organized crime, and I can give citations later. I don't really want to get bogged down on it. And through his activities, Gulf and Western bought a hotel in Acapulco called the Acapulco Towers, which they bought it from a group of investors, many of whom were involved with organized crime. And in 1970, there was a high-level organized crime summit meeting held in Acapulco, and agents of the United States government, the Mexican government, and a whole bunch of other governments tailed Meyer Lansky to this hotel where he was hidden from this surveillance and taken out of the country so that he could lose his surveillance, and all of which was done at this hotel owned by Gulf and Western. And there were some hearings into this by the Illinois Racing Board in 1970, where they tried to ask Charlie Bluthorn, who's the head of Gulf and Western, and other officials in Gulf and Western exactly how they got involved in all this. And the hearings are worth looking at, and I'll just refer people to them rather than go into them. There are other conglomerates, Parvin Dorman, which owned a whole bunch of Las Vegas casinos, among others. iOS, which first Bernie Kornfeld and then Robert Vesco managed to steal hundreds of millions of dollars from. Commonwealth United is another conglomerate, which since has collapsed. I think it's important to note that when these things collapse, it isn't the people. A number of conglomerates and other mob-controlled businesses collapse. And that doesn't mean that they've lost money. In fact, it means that they've made money and that they've drained the money out of the company. And by the time it collapses, the people who are left holding the bag are either creditors or stockholders who have been brought in long after there's a profit to be made. Parvin Dorman is a classic example. And the stock on Parvin Dorman went from nothing to 140 back down to nothing. And if you look at who made the killings and who got in and who got out, you'll see the pattern that I'm talking about. Now, it's very interesting that the three bank failures that have taken place in this country so far have all been connected to organized crime. I'm talking about the United States National Bank in San Diego, the Franklin National Bank in New York, and the Security National Bank in New York. And the modus operandi of organized crime is to use companies to wash money, to gain money for their own ventures, to lend money to their friends and associates, and to drain money. And eventually, many of these companies go under. But long after the money has been taken out and taken away, and bankruptcies are another example of how money is drained away. I don't want to get bogged down again. Now, one other thing I want to talk about is the relationship of corruption to all this. I think that it's clear that in the last 10 years there's been an increase in the amount of corruption, both financial and political, in the United States. And I think one of the reasons that's so is that the very nature of the economy, which is now more made up of paper and manipulations rather than basic industry and basic goods, lends itself to corruption. And if you take like a basic product like an automobile or steel or some kind of raw machinery or equipment, it's very hard to corrupt the product itself. There's corruption that might take place because you have to pay off somebody to get this and get that, etc. But at least there's a product that people buy on the marketplace that has some useful, social, productive use, and there's a product. But when your product is creating paper or giving credit or creating securities or loaning money, that process in and of itself is of little social productive use and lends itself by definition to corruption and manipulation and speculation and all kind of other things. Now, I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about Swiss banks and laundering of money and where does all this money go and how does it affect things. And it was organized crime who really perfected in the late 1950s, mostly through the efforts of Meyer Lansky, the ability to take large sums of money and disguise both their receipt and their disbursement and their transfer. And one of the ways it works is to, you need one weak link in the system which can disguise money, and you've got a laundry system. And so all you need is a bank or an institution somewhere that won't reveal, the entry or disbursement of a fund of money, and you can wash the money. Now, I don't know how familiar people are with Swiss banks and their operations, and Switzerland isn't the only place it happens. It goes on in the Bahamas, in Panama, in Luxembourg, in Hong Kong, in Beirut, the Cayman Islands, and a whole slew of places. But if I can cite you a few statistics, you'll get an idea of how much money we're talking about. The Federal Reserve Bank a few years ago estimated that there was over $200 billion in trusts held by Swiss banks. That doesn't include their assets or deposits. Those are trusts. And again, the estimates are usually low because there's no real way to get a handle on these kind of things. And it's interesting to note that the period of time in which a lot of these vehicles and a lot of these systems were set up relates to the Cuban situation in 1959, where organized crime had significant investments and were paying off Batista, according to Lucky Luciano's memoirs, to the tune of $300 million that Batista had secreted in Swiss bank accounts due to his collusion with Lansky and Luciano. As organized crime saw the decline and fall of Batista coming on, they pulled out, some of them did, in time. And in 1959, a number of banks were set up in Switzerland as a means of facilitating the withdrawal out of Cuba. And one of the banks which was set up has since been linked to the finances of Richard Nixon and Bibi Rebozo. And later on in the question period, I can get into the whole investigation by the Special Prosecutor's Office into Swiss bank accounts of Nixon and the role of some of these banks. But I wanted to point out at this point that one of the banks that was set up at that time was in part a move by organized crime to set up these kind of entities and begin to facilitate the movements of money. And I think the last thing I want to say is to point out that it's not limited to organized crime, the notion of washing money. The CIA, through its basic propriety holding company called the Pacific Corporation, which has, I think 20,000 employees is the figure, and over $200 million in assets. That's the basic entity which the CIA uses to wash its money. And corporations, so-called legitimate corporations, if you look at the Watergate hearings, you'll discover that I'm going to read you a list of which corporations used which kind of laundries to launder their illegal campaign contributions. Braniff Airlines washed their money through Panama. Minnesota Mining, American Airlines, and Goodyear washed their money through Swiss banks, and Ashland Oil also. Gulf Resources washed their money through Mexico. Gulf Oil washed their money through the Bahamas, and Northrop Corporation washed their money through Luxembourg. And if you, this is the Watergate report on campaign financing. And if you want to find out how money is washed and disguised, you ought to read those hearings in the appendix to the hearings. I just wanted to bring it up to show how the laundering of money is used by just about all segments of the economy that are interested in disguising money and handling large sums of money. And I think that's enough, for now. And I'd rather people ask questions than we.
It's been said by many assassination researchers, Gerth and on, that in the Kennedy assassination there was a convergence of interest between organized crime and perhaps some of the intelligence community, some of the anti-Castro Cubans coming from the Bay of Pigs, and that they had a common interest in the Kennedy assassination. Here I would like to know what documentation there is from that, and from Jeff or Peter I would like to know what reason is there to think that these groups would come together over something like the issue of Castro's taking over Cuba. I mean, would that provide the impetus for an action that extreme? What sort of money was involved in the loss of Cuba?
Yes, I think let's first of all look at the general symbiosis between organized crime and intelligence agencies, and then bring it back to the assassination. In an area like the Caribbean, where there isn't much this kind of productive economy that Jeff is talking about, where a very large source of income to the governments is tourism, and particularly hotels and casinos above all, the whole question of overthrowing a government and replacing it with a new government, consolidating a government, is frequently tied in with the idea of giving a casino license to somebody who can handle it, which usually means organized crime. Because why is that? Because if you open up a casino, you don't want to be stolen blind by card sharks, so you have to have people in there who can police a casino. Nobody does it better than the mob. So I think we have to put legitimate industry in there too. Let's take Cuba back in the 30s, for example. In the early 30s, there had been a revolution which looked like it might go to the left. It was cut off by Batista, who prevented that from happening. Batista consolidated his position with the help of Meyer Lansky, and the U.S. industry, which were worried about a move to the left, helped out by, for example, it was the National City Bank which owned the racetrack in Havana, and they leased it to Meyer Lansky. A lot of money was tied up in some of the hotels where Lansky also got the casino, or his brother Jake Lansky got the casinos. All of that is true even before you have a CIA. In the post-war period, where there's a lot of changing over on both sides, you frequently find organized crime on both sides, and may I say left and right, and you frequently also find the CIA on both sides, left and right. I think, for example, that Bosch in the Dominican Republic was overthrown with the help of U.S. intelligence, but it may be that he was also put into power with the help of U.S. intelligence. And on both sides, it's significant, I think, that Bosch's first fall from power in 1963, which is now the year we're talking about, came shortly after he had finally awarded an important casino license which various mafia groups were competing for. He had left one mafia group happy. He had left some other mafia groups unhappy, and whatever happened, within a couple of months he was out of power. The CIA, I think, have to keep track of all of this. If there were people in the CIA who were trying to consolidate the regime of Bosch, they know that the economy is very shaky. They know that the local industrialists are really opposed to him. They know what's going on the casino side. We also know that Frank Fiorini, who was in Watergate, had originally been helping out in a minor way to get Castro into power, and initially after Castro took over power in 1959 in Cuba, the man that he put in charge of his casino operations was, you've guessed it, Frank Fiorini. And then later on, when the CIA has made up its mind that it wants to get those people out, they also recruit for the Bay of Pigs Cubans who have been involved in various kinds of crime activities. Why? Because they're powerful muscle. They know how to kill. They know how to do things, and it's a matter of fact that Cubans in the who were already in the narcotics business were recruited by the CIA for the Bay of Pigs, and it's becoming more and more documented now that after the failure of the Bay of Pigs, the Cubans continued in their rather expensive anti-Castro activities with some support and some help from U.S. intelligence agencies, but also financing it on their own by continuing in the smuggling of narcotics, so that we've had quite a few rather prominent Bay of Pigs Cubans who have been arrested in the last 5 years for narcotics operations. The number 3 man in the Bay of Pigs has been arrested. I said last night that Artemis people were leaking stories about Oswald, the man they leaked to, Fernando Peñabaz, Bay of Pigs veteran, very active circulating stories about Lee Harvey Oswald. And he's interesting because he also circulated stories about Sirhan, and he's now in the federal penitentiary for smuggling something like 8.5 pounds of cocaine into this country. And that's a lot of money when you're talking about pounds of cocaine. So is that clear that the CIA uses the finances and the muscle of organized crime for political purposes in places like the Caribbean? I originally came into this because the same thing was going on in the Far East in Vietnam, where opium and heroin, if anything, are even more important in Southeast Asia than they are in the Caribbean, though historically very important in both areas. Now, does that answer your question, Bob?
Also, I was inquiring whether or not you felt that in Cuba you found a convergence of motive that could, is there documentation for an involvement of these interests in the Kennedy assassination converging around Cuba, and do you feel that there's sufficient motive? I know it's kind of a speculative question.
Well, I have to repeat a bit of what I was saying last night. Yes, there was in 1963 a joint CIA-DIA operation against Castro, and they were using the same Cubans. They were particularly using the Martimi crowd. They were using something called the MDC, the Movimiento Democrático Cristiano, which by 1963 was not very democratic and not very Christian. It was essentially the so-called Batista family, which has nothing to do with the dictator Batista, but with a very prominent financial family in Cuba, one of the richest families in Cuba, Agustin Batista, who was the financial backer of the MDC, and his brother Laureano Batista, who was the director of covert operations for the MDC. They had a training camp in New Orleans the time that Oswald visited there. Branguet knew about it. Branguet's first reaction to Oswald was that he was trying to infiltrate the MDC camp. The man in charge of operations at the MDC camp was a man called Victor Paneke, who was, we know from other sources, Frank Fiorini's top Cuban back in the 1959 period, operating in the Havana underground. And they, of course, had a common interest against Castro. Castro cleaned up the economy. He got the gangsters out. He had a regulated economy, and that is equally repugnant to organized crime on the one hand and established American industry and finance on the other. So you have a real coalition there against Castro. And now the last part of the question I think we could talk about, but maybe Jeff wants to say something about the general picture before we really focus on the Kennedy assassination.
Well, I don't have that much to add of a specific nature. I think that it's obvious in a general way. I've shown how organized crime and people around it are involved in the movements of huge sums of money internationally. And given one of the CIA's basic functions, they're obviously interested in the movement of large sums of money internationally because it has tremendous political and economic ramifications. The same thing can be said about the international movement of narcotics, and the same thing can be said about the need, especially in the Caribbean, as Peter's talking about, the need for political stability, as they call it, and organized crime has that same need. So in a general way, there's an obvious overlap, and in a way it's no different than any other major United States corporation which collaborates with the CIA in international, financial and political, like ITT in Chile and the CIA is a case study, and you can draw the same line between that and organized crime, the CIA, and the Dominican Republic, Cuba, etc. It's the same needs and the same commonality of interest that draw them together.